Welcome. This is Subin Cho of the WHIPIC, the International Center for the Interpretation and Presentation of World Heritage Sites under the auspices of UNESCO. A great pleasure to meet you all at the 2022 WHIPIC online lecture and webinar series. Starting from 25th August, WHIPIC is holding the online lecture and webinar series in cooperation with African World Heritage Fund and OurWorldHeritage. There are 5 sessions of lectures and webinars prepared under the theme Bridging the Gap 50 Years of the World Heritage Convention. We hope we can look through the history of World Heritage and talk about the future with World Heritage. Every event is open to all without any pre-register, and the recorded videos will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. Each session has time for a Q&A with general public participants' questions. Therefore, don't forget to leave your opinions and questions about today's topic and World Heritage issues in comments of the live streaming video, as we have time for questions. Now, I would like to introduce today's lecturer. Today's lecturer, Dr. Neel Kamal Chapagain, is an architect and heritage professional and educator from Nepal, currently engaged as an associate professor and the director of the Center for Heritage Management at Ahmedabad University in India, where he has been instrumental in setting up a graduate program on heritage management, a journal of heritage management, and an annual conference series on heritage management education and practice. He has recently been engaged with UNESCO on MOOC course on living heritage and sustainable development, preparation of academic learning outcomes based on competence framework for cultural heritage management, offering modules in sustainable heritage management core, and etc. He is also part of 2 university networks on heritage management in the Asia-Pacific region. He has a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, architecture doctorate from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and a Bachelor of Architecture from Tribhuvan University of Nepal. Based on his experience today, he will have a lecture on interlinking tangible and intangible, including memories in heritage interpretation. A great pleasure to meet you today, Professor Neel.
Thank you, Sobin. Greetings, everyone. First of all, let me express my sincere gratitude to the organizers for inviting me to this webinar, the lecture series. I have been listening to the previous lectures as well as the webinars that has been hosted by WHIPIC since 2020, and I'm happy to see the critical but pragmatic discussions we are witnessing on the theme of heritage interpretation. So much has been said and discussed, and we have identified some gaps that we must address and some possible ways forward. Under the broader theme, Bridging the Gap, I'm asked to share my thoughts and reflections on the topic given to me, which is interlinking tangible and intangible, including memories in heritage interpretation. This is the outline of my presentation today. I will first ask some critical questions, then review the situation, particularly with reference to some of the UNESCO's normative instruments, then examine the scenario with some cases from Nepal, and then reflect on heritage interpretive practices. I begin by reflecting on my own personal experience at the very beginning of my professional career in the heritage sector. I call it an interpretation dilemma, as I learned to navigate through the multiple interpretations involving both the tangible and intangible aspects of heritage. The key question for me is who interprets what for whom? As you can see in this slide, this is a small wall settlement called Lomantang in northwestern Nepal. You can see the broader landscape context within which the settlement is situated in the picture to your left, top left. My relation to this place began as a student of architecture, interested in studying urban architecture. But to understand the logic of this architecture, I had to understand the landscape context, the geologies, the cultural meaning, symbolism, and various memories associated with the landscapes. This was very fascinating to understand architecture through various layers of cultural and landscape features. I understood fairly quickly that architecture in such contexts cannot be seen in isolation, but in relation to the landscape, culture, and various other socioeconomic contexts, including collective memories. Yet, when I tried to explain it to the local people, they seemed least interested. I also saw that new houses would not prefer to follow the old ways. So there was a dilemma of my understanding of interlinking the tangible and intangible aspects in this particular context, which still exists there. Yet, in my professional work, the restoration of this Gompa, which you see on the left below, which is a Gompa, which is a Buddhist prayer building, when the restoration took place as a part of a conservation project, most people seem to have accepted it. There had been no objection to it. In the other image that you see on the right with the wall painting, when our wall painting restorer team followed an established conservation ethic to clean, consolidate, and restore the wall paintings, we ran into a serious problem. This problem is related to our interpretation of the wall paintings as a tangible art product having historic value. As you could imagine, the wall paintings team, and I acknowledge my team led by Dr. Rodolfo Lujan Lunsford and assisted by 𝗪𝗧𝗶𝗍, as they proceeded to restore the surviving fragments and leave the rest of the wall as blank since there were no wall paintings left. There was a demand from the local people to complete the Bodhisattva images no matter what. The suggestion from the local people was to complete the images rather than leaving it unfinished like what you can see in the slide, either by drawing and painting the missing parts to match the original, meaning have the full image of the Bodhisattva, or discard everything and repaint the whole thing. This is a long story, which I have written elsewhere. To tell the story in short, the ultimate resolution was a negotiation between the two extreme approaches and do a mix of both opinions, which you see on this image as well. That top part of the image is actually the negotiated resolution where some of the missing fragments were repainted, but in a different method. While the wall painting conservation was aiming to conserve the tangible remains in an authentic way, the locals wanted to go by their beliefs that such images should always be complete, meaning the Bodhisattva images should not have any ruptures, or there should be no amputations, otherwise it would not be accepted. Hence, I began my career with such a dilemma, which now I can call as a dilemma of interpretation. Then how do we interlink these two positions, one focused on the tangibles and the other emphasizing on the intangible, but still we can see that they need the tangible to connect to the intangible. And in general, this sets the tone for my talk today. Therefore, the topic given to me can be explored in multiple ways, but I would like to take a critical look at the topic itself and ask a question: why this topic and where it fits in the series that we have been going through WHIPIC's lecture series. For the lack of a better term, I call it the conundrum of interlinking tangible, intangible, as well as memory in heritage interpretation. So, in short, what are the conundrums? In my opinion, to distinguish a certain heritage as tangible or intangible, that itself is an outcome of interpretation. And then, when we try to interlink the two, the tangible and intangible, as well as memory, that is also a process of interpretation. In fact, the entire heritage making and managing can be considered as multiple processes of interpretation. The question is how the interpretation is done, by whom, and for whom. These are not only matters of perceptions, but also of interest and abilities and power. And I believe many of these issues have been discussed by the previous speakers in the series. Therefore, today I refer to some of the previous lectures and discussions in order to frame a scope for my presentation. All the previous speakers like Neel Silberman, Bill Logan, Damini Vijay Surya, Peter Will Larsen, Yuji Zhu, and others have covered much of the ground, and for today, I'll follow up specifically on two lectures. One by Damini, where he mentions some principles about heritage interpretation, in which he mentions that the overarching scope of interpretation is actually relates to the entire process of heritage management. And on that, I will add that the purpose of interlinking various perceived dichotomies like the tangible, intangible, natural, cultural can also be seen in a larger scope of heritage interpretation in relation to heritage management. And therefore, interpretation needs to begin right at the conceptualization stage and identification and listing of heritage. Attempt of interpretation with an objective of bridging the gap between the tangible and intangible, or natural and cultural, or memory and contemporary needs to begin at the very beginning of heritage processes. Interpreting such thematic linkages at the end of the heritage management process just to communicate to the public, in my opinion, doesn't make much sense. Such kind of interpretation might be very superficial, and at best, such interpretation done at the end of our work may only be like the icing on the cake. And therefore, I refer to another lecture that you had earlier by Dr. 𝐒𝐿𝐴, who suggested a ladder of interpretation, which is conceptualized in parallel to the Sarah Ernst's famous ladder of citizen participation. That was the literature from the 1960s. And I think Dr. 𝐒𝐿𝐴's comparison and proposal of ladder of heritage interpretation makes sense. Yet I'm tempted to suggest at least one more rug to be added to that ladder, which is at the further higher level of interpretation, which I provisionally call as a rung of enhancement of heritage discourse and framework. Probably that is a higher level of objective that heritage interpretation can achieve. And therefore, my approach here in today's talk is to examine how can heritage interpretation bridge the gap between the tangible and intangible, including memories, but also by doing that, how can we enhance our heritage management practice? With this framework, I have to look into the ground of heritage identification, values assessment, listing, and management framework. And if that is the way, then interpretation needs to look at all this process across. Before we get into the issue of interlinkages, I would like to first question whether there is a gap that needs to be bridged or interlinked. In other words, I would like to first question whether the tangible and intangible are indeed separate. If they are separate, then there is a gap, and that gap needs to be bridged. But I again question, is there such a gap to start with? At the outset, let me mention that interlinking tangible and intangible is not a new idea. At least where I'm speaking from, the South Asian cultural context, usually heritage would not be seen as the tangible or intangible or natural or cultural. You may have noticed many ancient manuscripts are listed in the Register of Memories of the World, the image that is represented on the left top of the slide. Many of such manuscripts are yet to be nominated, but I would like to refer a few here which relates to the building of ancient buildings, including temples. These ancient texts like Vastu Shastra, Maya Mata, Feng Shui, and there are many others. Some of such manuscripts may have already been registered under the Register of Memory of the World project of UNESCO. But the one I'm referring is not yet part of that register, but I had an opportunity to listen to a living practitioner and a scholar of such a manuscript, which was dealing with the building of a temple in South India. This was an interview with somebody called 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪 in the South Indian temple context. Now, this person, who is known as 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪, was asked to introduce himself in this interview. And the interviewer was expecting that he would introduce in one word. Because in literal English translation, the word 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪 would mean an architect. But this gentleman had a difficulty in explaining his role as 𝗪𝗪𝗪 to an English audience. Yet he took time to explain what his role would be in the temple, from making up the temple to maintaining to operating it, and so on and so forth. In his words and in his works, he is a priest who knows about what rituals to perform in the temple. But as a 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪, he also knows the rituals of building the very temple, physical building part of it. As someone responsible for building the temple, he said he would have to know the stones that he would have to work with. Then he would have to know the art of carving and erecting the entire structure. He would also have to know the music that accompanies the rituals in the temple, and that music actually should resonate with the building of the structure itself. And therefore, he should be aware about the music itself, and he should be a musician in that sense. And that music actually represents the whole concept of the particular temple, and so on and so forth. At the end, the Sthapati ended up asking the interviewer to figure out who he was. It was sure not simply was an architect. To me, this interview was an eye-opening moment. This in some ways explained the essence of heritage in that particular temple context, which I think resonates in many situations in South Asia. However, when we like disciplinary experts as architects or geologists or musicians or sculptors would see the temple in a particular disciplinary vantage point, we tend to see the temple in relation to our disciplinary perspective as a building, as a sculpture, as a place to go for certain rituals, and so on. So the lesson was that we have deconstructed a wholesome process and an image of a profession into a number of disciplinary silos. In its simplest form, these disciplinary silos have given rise to dichotomies like the natural and culture, tangible and intangible, temple and a shrine, and so on. Today, we have come so far in our educated mindset, it is very difficult to go back to the roots. Therefore, interpreting heritage in its wholesome essence with all these interlinkages in many times is a difficult, if not impossible task. But at the same time, it is there in everyday heritage. We just need to be able to see it. With this admission, let me proceed further to attempt to suggest some interlinkages to bridge this gap that we already have created in our minds. Thus, the dichotomies or separations or classifications have been a later creation, in my opinion, onto the heritage idea. Having said that, let me also acknowledge that the classifications of tangible and intangible sometimes are helpful as an operational concept. These are necessary to work. And there are some aspects of heritage which are mostly tangible than the intangible, and vice versa. Thus, it may have so happened that classifying heritage into tangible and intangible was necessary for a certain purpose. But perhaps, in my opinion, we ended up picking up only the tangibles over the intangible, or vice versa, and one aspect might have been left behind. So we are struggling, we want to catch up, we want to bring up as par with the other one. So there is this dilemma. And over the course of time, these two became two different or parallel tracks of heritage. That's what we're trying to bridge today. Yet, as I explain later, the parallel discourses seem to have come together to merge, and this is what we are focusing on today. Let me look at some mainstream texts or documents. Just like the Sthapati, I think many of our documents also recognize the interrelationship already way back, starting with Venice Charter, the very famous document which has often been criticized for being so much about material-centric heritage discourse that it doesn't consider intangible. But as I show you here in this slide, the Venice Charter in its very preamble does actually acknowledge the intangible concept of heritage as well. As I see, the preamble starts with this paragraph, imbued with a message from the past, the historic monuments of generations of people remain to the present day as living witnesses of their age-old tradition. Let me interpret. Here, the message from the past is memories, and the age-old traditions are the intangible heritage. The another paragraph, principles guiding the preservation and restoration of ancient buildings should be agreed and be laid down on an international basis, with each country being responsible for applying the plan within the framework of its own culture and traditions. Please pay attention to the red highlighted fonts, where we can see that it does recognize that the context needs to be paid attention, and therefore intangibles need also to be considered while dealing with tangible, and we need to sort of go by the local framework. Yet one wonders why then these important concepts that I have highlighted here have been ignored over the course of time. In my opinion, it is because the interpretation of such texts have not been done in the very beginning, and we somehow miss this message. Therefore, I argue that the act of interpretation needs to begin right from the beginning of identifying framing of heritage, way before we think of communicating it to the others, which is an essential part of interpretation. It is also essential to remember some of the principles of interpretation, and there are many texts, all the way starting from Freeman Tilden to the very famous Iname Charter of Heritage Interpretation and Presentation, which all emphasize on collaborative approaches and articulating the interpretation texts and materials and so on and so forth. If actually we follow these principles, I wonder how could we leave these intangible concepts behind and only talk about the tangibles, because this seems to be a major issue. So to understand these underlying regions, I wish to take a few minutes to go back to our history of heritage discourses, particularly with reference to the UNESCO's discourse relating to the World Heritage Convention, because I think that's the broader context we are looking at today. I think contemporary mainstream international heritage discourses evolved primarily in Europe and North American contexts, with English language mostly being the medium of conceptualization and expression. But this has come a long way since the 1950s, when conscious heritage movements began to take shape in the Europe and North America. These movements pertain to natural heritage, like the ones led by IUCN, and you see on the one column of the text on the slide. And then there is another one on the cultural sector led by UNESCO. And then there were also others which are not visible here, which is related to intangible, including the folk music and songs and so on, which are led by various organizations, including the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, and so on. I'd like to emphasize that the concerns about heritage, the broader scope, the specific natures of various heritage domains were being tossed upon by various groups who try to articulate these ideas and frameworks. Yet we can agree that the mainstream heritage movement, particularly the World Heritage Convention, had to involve the governments in this process. And that was one backdrop we need to keep in mind, which was triggered by the 1972 UNESCO's Convention on Protecting World's Natural and Cultural Heritage. This convention, popularly known as the World Heritage Convention, very aptly brought together two important but parallel works on heritage that you can see on the slide as well. The works to protect natural heritage and environmental protection led by IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which was already set to adopt its own system of world heritage, but on the natural heritage sector. And there was another one led by UNESCO, which after the successful campaign of Nubia and Venice, was also contemplating something around the same idea of world heritage. The concept of world heritage seems to be a parallel one in these two main discourses at that point in time. And they were all intending to create awareness and provide a mechanism to ensure that important natural and cultural heritage were indeed protected by governments. Because after the post-World War, the sovereign countries were being recognized, and that was the new United Nations order. So it was important to get these governments, the sovereign governments, to recognize the importance of world's natural and cultural heritage, despite the desperate drives for development activities and nation building processes. So the World Heritage Convention brought together these two parallel discourses of natural and cultural into one umbrella convention. But here I would like to highlight that some of us also recognize that in this process, there is also a voice about what we call today as intangible, raised by some of the member states of UNESCO. They particularly argued for the inclusion of folk music and songs. There are issues about the copyrights in the music industry and so on and so forth. But it is important to, this is important to remember the memory of the world in this heritage making process. But that is where the seeds of intangible cultural heritage were already sown in, but they couldn't bear roots into the World Heritage Convention in 1972. Perhaps for various valid reasons and circumstances, they were not considered in the World Heritage Convention text. But on the other hand, the World Heritage also later on tried to address that issue, that gap, as I discuss more later on. So the World Heritage Convention ended up being more place-based, more tangible discourse of heritage, which tried to promote a system across the world through this idea of outstanding universal value, which was supported by the standards of authenticity and integrity. Thus, they were concerned with the material, physical remains of the past, represented through material places, historic and cultural monuments, and sites. Here, we must recognize that while this set of conventions were happening, there are also another set of developments happening under the United Nations, where actually the intangible cultural heritage as a concept was very explicitly referred. And this is what I want to recognize here from the Convention on Biological Diversity. I will come back to this later. But before the Convention on Biological Diversity, I also want to recognize that the World Heritage Convention, as it became operational in 1975, and the operational guidelines was brought in 1978, it tried to address some of these gaps, for example, by introducing the idea of cultural landscapes in 1992. And then throughout the 1990s, there have been several initiatives to come up with strategies to address these gaps. And in this slide, if you see the summary of the evolution of the world heritage discourse, there has been constant attempts to address the gap which was missed out in the 70s to be formulated in this whole process. And the 1992, in the decade of 90s becomes very important, starting with this Convention on Biological Diversity, where you see that the convention text very clearly recognizes the various aspects of what we call today as the intangible cultural heritage, and I have highlighted those texts in red. And following this convention, we also see that UNESCO's other conventions also taking shape before and after the 1990s. But this unborn seed of intangible cultural heritage that was there in the context of the World Heritage Convention later on takes shape as a new convention in 2003. But before that, again, going back to the World Heritage Convention, the tangible discourse, it attempts to make its own effort to bring the intangible and memories into the picture through this idea of cultural landscape as a separate category into the World Heritage nomination process. And I would also like to here remind a very interesting work done by 𝐒𝐞𝐬𝐬𝐢𝐴, who looks at all these processes and recognizes UNESCO as creating heritage scape across the world. And so in this process, we also need to recognize that several efforts done by various intergovernmental committees under UNESCO, World Heritage Center, and others, and that's the result is seen in the World Heritage cultural landscapes, which I will refer later. And if you see some of the definitions, some of the categories of cultural landscapes, you see that the idea of intangible cultural heritage is already listed. And in the process, it also recognized the NARA document and authenticity. The category of cultural landscapes was meant to facilitate the interlinkages between the natural, cultural, and intangible, along with the memory. And I would like to quote here Ken Taylor in his book, where it says, talks about the intangible cultural heritage, that memory is the key here. In addition to saying the intersection of nature, culture, or tangible, intangible, Ken says that landscape is the repository of intangible values and human meanings that nurture our very existence. This is why landscape and memory are inseparable, because landscape is the nerve center of our personal and collective memories. However, what I find is state parties have not taken advantage of this cultural landscape category to imagine their World Heritage nominations. And I will discuss this with an example from Nepal in reference to my own work that I showed earlier, the site of Lomantang. And this I will come back. But again, going back to the World Heritage Convention, this is the site I'll come back. I would like to refer to the revised operational guidelines, revised since 2005, in which the reference to intangible cultural heritage has been finally made very explicitly. As you can see on the slide, the operational guidelines in paragraph 82 clearly lists various domains of intangible cultural heritage as equally valid reference to authenticity. And I highlight some of these for you here. So we can see that there have been several other efforts within the World Heritage Conventions, including what is called the 5 C's, the strategies that was defined by using the word C: credibility, conservation, capacity building, communication, and community. And why I mention here, because this strategies also apparently has 3 of them relating directly to people in one way or another, and 2 of them are actually at the core of the practice of interpretation. Now, this reminds us that interpretation could be a good way to work towards achieving this objective. So we can see that there have been efforts made, there have been ample spaces created by the World Heritage Convention itself to interconnect with the tangible and memories. We can further explore that interpretation in most of the cases in simple form is provided through oral narratives, and thus seem like it is mostly done in intangible form. But we have to also keep in mind that interpretation has a broader scope and methods, including curation of physical artifacts, experiential and engaging approaches, and exploratory and imaginative processes as well. Hence, interpretation process itself is better done at the intersections of tangible, intangible, memories, and imaginations. Therefore, interpretation can be an effective tool to bridge this gap that eventually was created because of several circumstances. And therefore, it is in this context that I would like to recognize a very important tool that has come through UNESCO as a new convention in 2003. This is the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention. And there was another convention in 2005 that we should not forget, which is on the cultural diversity as well. So let's look at the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention very briefly, because this convention is has become almost like a parallel convention to the World Heritage Convention. And I think this is where the gap seems to be coming in, at least in government's mind, because they have to work with two instruments now. So let's look at how this 2003 convention proposes to work forward. We should note that it doesn't exclude the tangibles from the consideration within the scope of intangible. And therefore, let's look at the definition as I highlight here, that for 2003 convention, it defines the intangible cultural heritage as the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, as well as the instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces associated therewith, that communities, groups, and in some cases, individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. So in the current global frameworks that most of the countries follow, we have got two equally strong and influential heritage conventions in place. And one of the role for interpretation is to really be able to interpret in a way that these two powerful instruments are used for the benefit of better interpretation. And this, on the one hand, is the World Heritage List. And then there is this intangible cultural heritage. Now, this is on the broader framework and my review of what happened, how we ended up in this situation. Now, to continue the discussion, let me use some concrete cases. And in this case, I use some references from Nepal and my observations. As you may know, Nepal has ratified both the 1972 and 2003 conventions. While Nepal was one of the first member states from Asia to have nominations to the World Heritage List, it has not yet nominated any element of ICH, Intangible Cultural Heritage, under the 2003 convention. Therefore, now at this point, let me look at some of the nominations from Nepal in the World Heritage Property, both in the full list, also the tentative list. And I would like to explore what is the status of integration of tangible and intangible in the heritage practice with reference to these sites. The first one is the Kathmandu Valley World Heritage Site, which was one of the first sites to be nominated from Asia in the World Heritage List. It is listed under the criteria 3, 4, and 6, which actually do recognize the intangible aspects, as I highlight here, as an integral part of the justification of the nomination. A living urban ensemble like the Kathmandu Valley World Heritage Site, and there are 7 monument zones within this World Heritage Site. A full understanding of this cannot happen unless we pay attention to people, their culture, their everyday life, cultural practices, and how their practices have evolved over time. Without this understanding, the urban fabric and space, the OUV cannot be understood. And this urban fabric and space interacts with the everyday as well as ceremonial rituals and functions, in a way, the parts of intangible cultural heritage. However, the key point is the management, including the nomination dossier and the management process, has been mostly silent on these intangible aspects, particularly how this needs to be connected to the management process. Because in reality, the urban development had not complied to this narrative that you see on this slide. And in fact, because of this, the World Heritage Committee decided to put these sites in the list of World Heritage List in danger in 2003, and this was finally removed in 2007. And what we find in the appeal from the Nepal government in 2007, when it was removed from the danger list, was that it is invoking a lot of intangible aspects to be considered. And although the management should have looked into this earlier, but in 2007, in the justification, the dilemma is it mostly dealt with the core and buffer zone redelineation only. So the livingness of the whole urban context has not been accounted as properly as it should have been. But what happens in the 2015, there was massive earthquakes that Nepal faced. And in that aftermath of the earthquake, it was again evident that the physical authenticity of many monuments in this Kathmandu Valley World Heritage Site were compromised. Yet, when a case for not listing the site into the danger list again in 2015, and again, actually, this was discussed in several meetings since 2015 at the World Heritage Committee, and the government of Nepal always argued that it should not be put into the danger list. And when it was argued, it has always invoked the notions of intangible cultural heritage, the living traditions, which eventually leads to cyclic renewal and reconstruction process and all that. So it is very important to see that when the World Heritage Committee accepted not to put it into the World Heritage List in dangers, you will see in these slides that it has actually accounted for the intangible aspects more than the tangible aspects. And on that ground, this is not yet put into the danger list. Whereas if you would actually go by the original definition of OUV being very much physical, the physical OUV have been compromised during the earthquake, the consequences of earthquake. So this demonstrates that practically there is an intertwined relationship between the tangible and intangible heritage in this urban context, historic urban context. But somehow this has been used for certain purpose and not necessarily in a genuine manner. That is my critique of the whole process. And therefore, we need not go elsewhere to find this relationship. We can look at how the repair works or even reconstructions are going on today in the Kathmandu Valley, where the craftsmanship have to be considered. For example, in this image you see from the Patan Darbar Square, several of the fallen artifacts has been lined up. And as you study this, these are about beliefs, these are about art, but these also tell you the sequence of building, the process of building. And the good thing is the Kathmandu Valley still have many living artisans who could actually reproduce this. So the cyclic renewal and reconstruction have been justified on the basis of the intangible aspects, which otherwise were not really thought of seriously in this whole process. So this intangible heritage, in fact, in this case, has come to rescue and rebuilding of these heritage sites. There is also another dimension of intangible heritage that offers resilience to people in these situations, like the earthquake in Kathmandu Valley. And the slide you are seeing is a traditional settlement of 𝐒𝐭𝐫 in northeastern part of Kathmandu. When I visited the village of 𝐒𝐭𝐫 right after the earthquake, the scene was really heartbreaking, like you can see in this image. However, in some of the corners here, I saw this particular situation, and this gave me kind of a hope in this very sad situation. This was a small open roadside shrine with a fresh offering of flowers and leaves with red vermilion that very morning that I visited. And this actually gave both the residents and visitors like me a sign of hope. Such is the power of intangible heritage, which time and again are integral part of such living heritage sites. The challenge then is how does one go about interpreting them? Because you don't find these kind of interpretations happening in a normal day in these kind of urban settings. And I think that's where we are missing. And this is how we need to learn our own lessons. We're also attuned because we're also attuned to look at and listen to the bricks and mortars that we hardly see the invisible beliefs and practices that provide meaning to these places and that offers resilience in these difficult times. And therefore, I argue that it is high time that our interpretation of built fabric should also consider such sources of inspiration and resilience, which are very invisible, very intangible, but very powerful. However, I must confess, as much as such rhetoric was used to defend or avoid the listing onto the danger list, the reference to intangible cultural heritage, including thriving craftsmanship, has been only sporadically done. If you look at the work going on in Nepal with contractors, both Nepali and foreign, keen on experimenting with new technologies and building back better, and sometimes building back better than what these monuments were all about, this is very prevalent. In some cases, some community groups had protested about sort of unauthentic practices, and that had led to correction in the course of intervention, thus forcing the authorities to resort back to some of the traditional practices. But in many cases, it is not publicly known what has been the nature of intervention in these sites. Hence, the reference to communities, their cultural practices, and their knowledges have been mentioned in the documents and dossiers and management processes, but I'm afraid the effective interlinkages of this tangible and intangible have not happened as one would expect in these living urban heritage sites. This is where, again, UNESCO's 2003 Convention on Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage would have been insightful. In the context of the Kathmandu Valley World Heritage Site, I would like to say that Nepal has ratified the 2003 Convention and is currently looking into preparing its own ICH inventory at the national level. Yet the authorities who are looking into the World Heritage Sites, which is the physical domain, managing them, have already begun to connect to the intangible heritage in relation to the World Heritage Monument Zones. And this is where I'm trying to point out the parallel practice that is happening in the same site. For example, a series of heritage walks have been designed. Like, for example, if this slide, you have the boundary of one of the monuments in the Kathmandu Valley World Heritage Site. Now, what the authorities, the Kathmandu metropolitan city is doing is they have already designed several of heritage walks. They have already identified also several routes through which festivals and chariot processions have gone through. So they are working on it, but what probably still needs to happen is an integration of these two concepts in the integrated management process. I would also like to mention that just like the monuments in physical sense, the festivals can also be considered as a higher form of cultural expressions. These help us understand the essence of street patterns, the nodes and squares, the narrow space and the wider space, the volume through which chariots have to go through, the open spaces where the crowds can come together, the religious spaces where the processions must connect to a temple or to a community, and so on and so forth. So this is how the intangible actually helps us to understand the tangible, very tangible aspects as well. And the tangible aspects gives the context to the intangible to come alive. As one explores the historic cities of Kathmandu Valley through the lens of festivals or rituals like the one that you see in the slide, this is in Lalitpur in Patan, it becomes clear that the physical fabric and space of the city makes sense when it is related to the cosmic beliefs, cultural celebrations, and rituals and collective memories. No wonder, as 𝗪𝗲𝗰𝗁𝗍 suggests in one of her books, the tangible makes sense through the intangibles. Yet, when one looks at the physical forms and designs, the artwork and structural needs manifest themselves in so physical way that their material authenticity also matters. So I'm not denying the material authenticity, but as you have seen in the post-earthquake reconstruction, many times losing the material authenticity also is not a major issue as long as the living intangible practices are there. Hence, sites like Kathmandu Valley find themselves caught up in these intricacies of tangible and intangible. They are existing on their own world, but also as a very intertwined, in a very intertwined setting as well. And so, is interpretation easy or is it difficult? It seems easy also, but in reality, we see that it's also not that easy. But then I think about the state party. What should do then? Like, what should the state parties do then? Already the Kathmandu Valley is in the World Heritage List, in which we can see that the festivals are mentioned, but they are only like the icing on the cake. It can be anticipated now that Nepal will proceed to nominate some of the famous festive processions, like the 𝗓𝗏𝗪𝗓, onto the UNESCO's representative list of ICS under the 2003 convention, because we have created a system whereby the government or the society is expected to follow either this track or that track, right? And this is where I think interpreters can play a major role. That becomes an opportunity to conceive and communicate heritage in its totality. What you have on the slide is an article by Samyukta Shrestha. He mentions the local municipality, the Kathmandu Metropolitan City's decision to make 𝗓𝗏𝗪𝗓 one of the very prominent festival in Kathmandu Valley, which is connected to the World Heritage Site as well, as a global celebration. And one can anticipate it might be in the 2003 UNESCO list as well. But how much of that goes into the World Heritage Management is a question. So I think interpreters have an important role to play here. Our interpretive practices have an important role to play here, but it has to start right from the beginning of conceptualization of our heritage. This is where I see some opportunities, and let me try to discuss some of them. These are some of other images from the Kathmandu Valley World Heritage Sites. These are from Patan. And you can see these are not empty spaces. A lot of time when we describe our historic cities, urban fabric, we tend to describe them as a container in terms of the bricks and mortar in the historic fabric and all that. But we need to also interpret these structures as a site where a lot of contemporary things happen, a lot of continued cultural practices happen. So these sites provide the cultural context, and the details lie in the intangible aspects that one has to go and see in different parts of the year, different cycles of the year and all that. And therefore, one has to relate it to relate these sites to what it means for contemporary society as they follow their cultural practices, and they might have other memories associated with L also. So our whole narrative of urban heritage needs to be redefined by interlinking these two parallel tracks of heritage discourses. So then it's not about just historic, it's also about very contemporary. But we also need to keep in mind when you think of memory that these sites being, apart from being a historic and cultural site, and their use as historic and cultural sites, many of them also have a tragic memory attached now. For example, this slide has this Kasta Mandap being visible here, and this has a tragic reference with regards to the 2015 earthquake. This is part of the 𝗪𝗏𝗪𝗏𝗪𝗏 Square site in the Kathmandu World Heritage site. On this site, on 25th April 2015, when the earthquake took place, a blood donation camp was being held at this very public building, which is on the back. This is supposedly the oldest structure in the valley, and it has the story of being built from the timber derived from a single tree. So there are a lot of stories associated with it. And actually the name Kathmandu comes from the word Kastamandapa, which is the name of this particular building, the one on the back. And this image is after the restoration. However, that unfortunate day, not only did this historic building entirely collapse, but also it took so many lives. So in the new interpretation, it is worth remembering this memory, the tragic memory. Thus, it is a site of memory as well. And here, interpretation needs to be humane, and such memories need to be accounted for, but sensitively. On the other hand, the earthquake destruction opened up room for reconstruction. There was a possibility of archaeological excavation, and they did excavate the foundation of this very building, which was not excavated for long. And this excavation revealed that there were new evidences to suggest that the history of this building actually goes further back. So the unfortunate earthquake of 2015 has given mixed narratives and memories to this site. And therefore, today's narrative is a complicated one because it has to account both for these opportunities, but also the tragic memories that it has since 2015. Perhaps, therefore, an interpretation can open up possibilities of moving back and forth between the scientific logic of the structure to cosmological beliefs, from a historic function to contemporary affiliation, and memories of all kinds that have been associated with such sites and buildings. Yet we are still in a dilemma. All these interconnections do not happen. And to explore this, I look at the tentative list of the World Heritage sites that Nepal government currently has, what you see on the slide right now. As you can see here, at least there are 15 tentative sites as of now, and at least 12 sites have clear connections to living communities in or around these sites. Many of these clearly deserve to be considered as cultural landscapes, and thus there is an opportunity to connect to the people, cultural, intangible cultural heritage, as well as memories, like I will discuss with the example of Lohmanthang. But so far, in the context of Nepal, we are missing this opportunity of interlinkages. Let me now elaborate this with a little bit focus on this site of Lohmanthang. I already introduced this site of Lohmanthang to you. It is considered as the cultural capital of the region of Upper Mustang. It's a very unique living earthen walled settlement in the Trans-Himalayas. It reminds us of a great historical and cultural evolution that takes place in this entire region, the Trans-Himalayan landscape. And therefore, the historic, apart from the historic importance, one also needs to see how the culture, the building practices evolved in this particular historic settlement. Much of the 15th century physical fabric is still alive there, what you see in the slide here, along with the native population. And that's a very powerful context for this site. However, in 2008, the Department of Archaeology of the government of Nepal nominated this particular site into the tentative list under the criteria 2, 5, and 6. And this is where I find it as a dilemma that in this nomination, it has entirely missed out the broader cultural context, like this kind of festivals, which are actually the prime attraction for tourism today. And these could have been part of the way of understanding the urban fabric here. But this also relates to the entire landscape. For example, I had the privilege of working on this particular site here, you see, which I mentioned earlier, also the dilemma of interpretation. Now, when I studied and understood this site, actually, one cannot understand this physical fabric unless one relates to this broader landscape like this, because it connects to the different kinds of soil one can gather from different parts of the valley to build different parts of a building, including the wall paintings. And one cannot understand the physical fabric unless one understands the cultural traditions like the one you see on the left, and the very building traditions, the knowledge systems that you see on the right. And I don't have the time to go into detail, but in this practice, you see the interlinkages between the tangible and intangible are really happening on an everyday basis in this physical fabric. And when we are restoring, we have to account for that. We have to revive some of these traditional techniques and all that. And I mentioned this, not only the team had to restore wall paintings, we also went to find out how many layers of plaster had to be created, where the soils come from, what is the mechanism, and all that. So in a way, intangible is already embedded in our practice. It has to be embedded, not just in these technical processes, but also in very socio-cultural processes. For example, various rituals had to be followed, and these rituals gives confidence in the process and all that. I have written about this elsewhere. I'm not going into detail, but I'm trying to suggest how in this entire landscape, intangible is so integrated part of it. And when you see a landscape like this, this particular slide, it also has several oral stories from the very ancient history to recent history, and there are memories embedded, like many caves here, very have these memories from the last century, and one cannot discount this today. But unfortunately, the proposed nomination doesn't account for this one, and therefore I see a missing opportunity in this nomination, and therefore I'm using this example to suggest that enough has been created. Our discourses are evolving, but we need to translate this into practice, and I see this as an opportunity now. Now, this reminds me, as much as in Nepal this has not happened, but I would like to look into some other South Asian contexts to see whether there are some signs of hope. As much as the Nepal's 12 tentative nominations have not considered cultural landscape category, I'm very happy to say that in Bhutan, a neighboring country has already done that. Actually, before into that, in this context, I also need to mention that this region in Nepal, the Upper Mustang region, has been part of a very important and successful nature conservation project called Annapurna Conservation Area Project. And that project is considered as one of the very successful people-centric nature conservation projects. But what happened when I worked there in the early 2000s, there has been a very kind of practical disconnect between the natural heritage discourse and the cultural heritage discourse. And I wanted to mention here as well. So despite in this 1972, the natural world and cultural world brought together in the World Heritage Convention, but it's still what we see, at least in case of Nepal, is even when we're working under this convention, we tend to miss out in interlinking the two parallel tracks, like the cultural and natural, the tangible and intangible. However, in Bhutan, I am very happy to see that this has been at least attempted to be addressed. Because when I came to know, I worked in Bhutan way back in 2002, 2003, and I had high hopes that Bhutan would go a long way in this discourse. And recently, I'm happy to learn that UNESCO had also offered some capacity building programs to promote cultural landscape as a concept, to look into Bhutanese heritage. And since Bhutan has not any World Heritage nomination yet, I think the idea was to nominate cultural landscapes as a category. And I think that's a very great. And that actually fits into a broader concept that Bhutanese government has, which is the concept of gross national happiness, GNH, which is really a unique economic and governance concept that Bhutan has. This concept of gross national happiness, unlike the gross domestic product, already encompasses the intangible aspects like happiness, which is then connected to cultural heritage and environmental sustainability as well. And Bhutan's constitution actually recognizes this very clearly. And it is therefore makes sense that Bhutan may find it easy to refer to the cultural landscapes construct. A few years ago, these projects were going on, and I'm looking forward to the outcomes of this. But at the same time, I also found a very interesting project that happened in the same process of capacity building initiatives in Bhutan, where there was this project actually looked at the technology to connect to the cultural aspects. And this is a project of creating a Buddhist metaverse, which was given the name 𝗪𝗏𝗪𝗓, which had this chatbot kind of things, which called the Buddha bot, in which they try to create virtual connection through machine learning and virtual reality games to connect people to teachings of the Buddha. I'm not going into detail, but this reminded me that, probably there are other opportunities that are arising today. I'm not sure how effective this particular example has been, but at least this reminds us that there are technological opportunities for us to promote these interlinkages as well. There are new possibilities. But I would also like to remember that even before the technological aspects, we see that there have been various other sort of enacting practices where the tangible and intangible has been connected. I'll come back to this. So to conclude, I would like to highlight a few points regarding the interlinkage of the tangible and intangible, including memories through heritage interpretation. First, I would like to refer to Peter Howard in this particular book, in which he suggests that sometimes, depending on the situation, no or minimal interpretation is also a good interpretation. And in the same line of thought, I tend to think that sometimes not declaring something as heritage becomes an efficient way to let the wholesome existence and experience of that particular potential heritage to remain true to itself before it gets codified as tangible or intangible, or natural or cultural heritage. But if in case we'd like to recognize that as heritage, then I suggest that the interpretation needs to kick in at the very stage of conceptualizing that particular thing as heritage. That's my first concluding remarks. Second, as I have tried to show, I argued that the interpretation needs to begin at the very early stage of conceptualizing a discourse, because later on to communicate as an interlinked concept is very difficult. And therefore, you know, the important discourses like the World Heritage Convention and the ICS Convention needs to be thought through in the very beginning, and this probably offer some opportunities. So I think we need to look into this interlinkages, not just between the two conventions, but also between various stakeholders from the public to the government and all that. Third, I would like to suggest that language is another consideration that interpretation needs to look at, because sometimes language, even a word, becomes a key. Because some words, there might be keywords in the local language which probably capture so much about the essence of heritage. And in fact, in my teaching, I use this exercise to try to translate various concepts of heritage into local languages. And this has been a revealing experience. I don't have the time to go into detail, but based on that, I suggest that at least some keywords in the local language may allow us to avoid unnecessary segregation of concepts, which might otherwise already be there as an integrated concept in the local context. For example, the earlier picture of the chariot in Kathmandu, if one starts interpreting that chariot as a form of intangible cultural heritage, there are chances that we'll be referring to, we'll be missing to refer to the physical aspects of that. Similarly, when we start interpreting a temple as a physical thing, we have the chances to miss out on the various other aspects, like that initial story of the 𝗍𝗶𝗖 that I shared. So I suggest that language is a key, and how do we think through? Language is not just a word, it's about thinking, it's about a whole philosophy that is there. And I think interpretive practice should look into this. Fourth, more like my appeal to the interpretive practitioners, that not to put interpretation in silos of natural or cultural or tangible or intangible domains to start with. I think it is very important. And because interpretation is an opportunity to navigate seamlessly through the wholesome experience and understanding of heritage. Yes, we may have sometimes a primary mandate to anchor our interpretation to a certain organization or certain framework or certain audience interested in either natural or cultural or intangible or tangible or human or non-human and something like that. But, and even if we start in that kind of a siloed way, a classified way, I think interpretation always is an opportunity which allows us to cross the boundaries of those mandated domains and let the complementary information come through. So I would urge that, you know, look out for those opportunities. And fifth is kind of second appeal to the interpretive practitioners, that let's always be interdisciplinary. Let's think out of the box. Let's think out of the boundaries. Let's be intergenerational in our approach, and perhaps intersubjective also in many cases. And sixth, about the technology, interactive interpretation. Before technology, there have been people-led practices, like I'm thinking of the Colonial Williamsburg in the US as an example, where the historic site has been enacted by people by practicing the language, practicing certain crafts, and reenacting the history. I think as an interpretive practice, this has been very powerful to communicate the integrated message between the tangible and the intangible. The technology has been wonderful. There are various 3D modeling, the augmented realities, virtual realities, and all that kind of things have come up. So my urge is to really look at these as an opportunity to enhance our interpretive practices, and they can help us to really interlink these dimensions. And the last point for today is to recognize the limitation as well, not to think that interlinkage can always happen. Perhaps sometimes interlinkages may not be necessary or feasible. So we need to keep that in mind, because interpretation, the very idea of interpretation is not to give a full lecture or full content about certain heritage. It is rather to help the audience understand, connect, and as 𝗓𝗏𝗏𝗏 says, it is about provoking some thinking. And therefore, we may start with certain particular idea, like tangible or intangible, and that's totally fine. Sometimes it may not be possible to interlink. And I think these limitations we need to also keep in mind. To conclude, let me use one of my favorite examples that I have used elsewhere and I've written about it as well. I think this will give us a kind of a metaphorical conclusion, but also a very powerful conclusion to conclude my argument here. About 20 years ago, I lived in this neighborhood in Kathmandu called 𝗪𝗪𝗠𝐻. There was this image that you see in the crossroad that I used to walk through. Here, as you see, and by the way, this is not a protected monument. It's an everyday monument, not listed. But it always puzzled me. And I kept myself asking, if you can look at this image, whether the tree was there before the temple or the temple was there, so which came first? And also to see which in the right position, is it the temple or the bricks and the stones? Because for me, as a conservation architect at that point in time, I was looking at the conservation issues. I began to investigate. This is a long story. I've written it elsewhere. But the kind of questions I asked is what led me to this investigation. And then I finally decided to interact with people to find out, and you see some of them there. They were the local residents for whom this was an everyday ritual, but also everyday pastime. And when I asked them my curiosity as a young heritage enthusiast, they in return asked me, what is the problem with you? Why are you so up in kind of separating this tree with the temple, or temple with the people, or tangible with the intangible? Why are you asking this kind of, why is this important to you? That's the question they asked me. And the people said, we have grown up with this, seeing them together, and they are inseparable. We don't want to worry about whether to separate the tree and the temple. Similarly, we don't think whether we are our practices are important or the bricks and mortar are important. They are inseparable. And so to me, this was the best interpretation I learned, to see heritage in its context and not to impose my own biased framework to tease them apart from their wholesome existence and essence. I think as an interpretation, we need to keep this in mind and try to frame our interpretation in that sense. Then only interlinking these concepts will be possible. I hope this makes sense to you all. Thank you very much for listening to me today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Neel, for your insightful lecture. And it was really great that you've summed up how heritage interpretation should be made in 7 points. And I would like to show my gratitude to you for keep following up all the online lecture series we had with Professor Neel, from Professor Neel to Mario and Elise. And it was great that you've quoted their lectures in your presentation, and also have suggest another point on what our lecturers suggested in their presentation before. Genuinely appreciate for your insightful lecture. And well, our general public participants on our YouTube and Facebook left a lot of comments and questions. So I will. So let's start today's Q&A session. Well, here's our first question, and the question is left by Laya. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing, but it's left by Laya Gonzalez. And the question is, can you cite some pain points in the interpretation of intangible heritage, particularly those concerning governance issues, or the negotiation of meaning? How did you deal with these challenges as a heritage professional?
Thank you. Thank you for this question. It's an excellent question. And I have not dealt with this example that I want to show, which is related to the Kathmandu Valley World Heritage Site. The festivals that I referred in my slides as well, they are run by communities through a system called GUTHI, G-U-T-H-I. And this GUTHI itself are very powerful concept. They are at times tangible, they are also intangible. They are community groups. So there are several definitions, and people have written PhD dissertations on this. What happened in the new governance systems in Nepal after 2006, one of the government thought this was unnecessary wastage of the government resources, and it tried to stop government support to these GUTHI-led festivals. And there was a huge protest from the communities, and the government had to withdraw its decision. So I think not me or any professional groups, but it was the communities which actually came forward to claim the power of their intangible cultural heritage, and the government had to accept that. That's one instance how it was resolved. But if I were to, like you mentioned, the pain points, if I refer to a painful moment, it goes back in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, when the heritage regulations were being framed in the country. In that process, this very idea of 𝐤𝐤 was not understood by the governance system, and they tried to dismantle the 𝐤𝐤 systems, or at least made the traditional 𝐤𝐤 systems dysfunctional various ways. I think this had a very bad repercussions for us, and I think we are still regretting that fact. And that probably is still a painful moment for us in Nepal. But having said that, let me also mention that I would also not like to say that all the traditional practices are good, because within the 𝐤𝐤 also, I have discussed elsewhere again that there are problems and we need to address those problems. So, so that scope is there, but I think that's what happening. So, so this example of 𝐤𝐤 is probably the good example I can give you to answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. And I think we can move on to our second question. The second question is, often there are disputes around whether local communities should be allowed to perform traditions or whether site protection should be given priority. In this case, how do you think heritage interpretation can intervene in the delivering various values?
Thank you for another great question. In fact, I was very tempted to use another example from Kathmandu World Heritage Site, which actually I faced in 2013 when, as 𝐒𝐿𝐭𝐴𝐲𝐻 Nepal, we organized an international conference on living heritage, managing living urban heritage. There, one interesting conversation we had in one of the monuments in Kathmandu Valley World Heritage Site, where the practice with the temple was that their intangible cultural heritage has been a tradition where this temple was not supposed to be open, at least the main shrine was not supposed to be open for anybody other than the priest, and they had to do some repair works. And they were in a dilemma whether to forget about the tradition and then open the shrine for the experts, the UNESCO mission at that point, to go and see. And that was the discussion. And what we suggested from 𝐒𝐿𝐴𝐻 Nepal was we adhere to the tradition. We don't need to change the tradition at this point. And so we recommended that. So I think that was a very interesting moment. But at the same time, I've also seen, again, in the case of Kathmandu, where many times where, let's say, certain paintings, certain things inside a sanctuary was not supposed to be seen. In the name of documentation, this was made public. My personal opinion would be that if the tradition is not to disclose, we better respect that. But I admit that there have been some instances in Nepal where this tradition has been sort of negotiated and people have, or communities have opened up their thing. But I think these decisions cannot be taken by one side. It has to be a collective decision through negotiations. But there has been several instances like that, and the best way is collaborative interpretation. And that's why I think interpreters sometimes can give voice to the communities, and therefore it is very important that they understand from the community perspective as well, but also as a professional, they understand the professional or the government viewpoints. And when they see challenges there, they should try to resort to these collaborative participatory processes, because then that leads to some kind of a dialogue. And I think we can find a more agreeable solutions to any challenges there. That would be my response. Thank you. And I've done this in the case of Mustang, where I worked on the site I shared. But I think Kathmandu Valley has several of these instances. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. And there are a lot of comments left on our lecture, so I will read out some comments left on today's lecture. This comment is left by 𝐒𝐿𝐴𝐻𝐿𝐴𝐻𝐿, and Shakur said that thank you for your descriptive presentation. And 𝗪𝗛𝗪𝗏 also left a comment saying that thank you for this interesting and informative lecture. Thank you for joining today's lecture. And there are a lot of questions, so I think we can talk about this one as our third one. Well, this is more of a comment which is left by Xuan Li on our YouTube, and here's the comment. I understand the crucial point of interlinkaging the tangible and intangible aspects. However, heritage interpretation not only exists in heritage sites, but it can be active in museums or other institutions. If I may add a comment, it will be necessary to consider them along with the heritage interpretation in real areas.
Absolutely. That's a great comment. And thank you for highlighting this part. As I mentioned in the very beginning, heritage interpretation needs to start right from the beginning of conceptualization. And this is where, like I use the example of trying to nominate a certain site into heritage, the World Heritage List. If at that very moment we don't think about these interlinkages, then it is not going to happen later in the management process because we'll have missed the point there. And you are absolutely right. I think we should also think about museums. More importantly, we should also think about the educational processes, right from, let's say, the school education to visitor education to community education, but also in the education for professionals. So yes, there are various dimensions. It is not about just interpreting the heritage on the given site. It is about, today the digital space is so much powerful. The social space, the websites, the museum, virtual spaces. Now there are virtual sites also being created. So I think you are absolutely right that this has just opened up so many opportunities to us, and we should pay attention to all of these different platforms and these different opportunities. I think on a positive note, these requirements are really forcing us to really think interpretation in a serious way, in more powerful way, but also more engaging way. And I think we have a lot of opportunities in that. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. And due to time, I think this one may be our last question for today. So here's our last question for today. And it is important to respect intersubjective interpretations, but how should we gather all those interpretations and use them?
Yes, very important question again. And I think this was addressed in earlier episodes of the series as well. And I'm glad that professionals, colleagues around the world have highlighted this. And I think today's time is even more important to consider this intersubjectivity in heritage interpretation. And I don't think there is a formula to it, but my belief is that first thing is, as I mentioned in one of the my suggestions, is to be open. Because once we are open, then we always keep room for another viewpoint, which is very important. I know probably what you also have in mind is being open and having so many intersubjective ideas, the subjective ideas, it might also lead to a conflict. But avoiding them is no better. Avoiding them perhaps creates more conflict than including them. Therefore, my approach would be to include all kinds of interpretation, but perhaps not taking a side and not deciding on which is authoritative or which is a valid one. I think the interpreter's role or the role of interpretive practice is to give voice to all and probably find a way to not take a side and let it be there. But I think over the course of time, through our processes, the participatory processes and all that, we should find a way that all these different voices actually talk to each other and at least have a culture of respect and resilience. I think that's what we should aim for. And I think there are various mechanisms, various frameworks that have been discussed today across UNESCO, ICOMOS, and several bodies, which are useful. I think it's a work in progress, but it's important, and that's my viewpoint. But thank you for this very important question. And if you have not watched, I encourage you to watch earlier episodes, which actually touched upon this very important issue in a longer term. Thank you.
Thank you for your insightful lecture and also your wonderful answers for our public participants' questions and comments. Thank you for today. And before we end today's event, would you like to leave a comment to our public participants?
No, I think I just like to thank you to you as well, organizers, everyone at WHIPIC for inviting me for this lecture and for all the audience for your time and for the great questions that you have asked. I think this is a work in progress. This is a long way for us to go, but as I try to highlight, I think we have come a long way. In many of these are not new ideas. It's been there in different cultural contexts in different ways. And there is so much to learn from the diverse cultural context that we live in today. And with the connectivity, I think we have opportunities to learn from each other. Let's work in this spirit and collaborate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hope we can keep cooperate in the future and cooperate on the making heritage interpretation into a better way and developing those kind of techniques that will be helpful for everyone. So thank you very much for today, and hope you have a great day. And now I'd like to briefly introduce our next lecture. So the upcoming session will be the final session of the 2022 WHIPIC online lecture and webinar series. At the webinar in November, we will have time to talk about how World Heritage interpretation and presentation should be made in practice, especially in regard to the World Heritage policy. Further information, including the participating professionals and the schedule for it, will be announced on WHIPIC's website and social media platforms. Thanks again for joining us today, and do not miss the final session of the 2022 WHIPIC online lecture and webinar series in November. Then, just in case, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.